Hey guys, and welcome to my NFC South grades, for the draft. We're obviously going to be starting off with Atlanta here. And, with that being said, I'm just going to jump right into it. I'm probably not going to go in the exact order of the alphabetical here, just because I think that would be a little bit less fun. We're going to start off with kind of a we're going to start off with, Atlanta, though, who had an interesting draft. So I think that Jalen Walker being their pick at 15, I think this is a very, very, very good pick. It doesn't surprise me. A guy who can play linebacker, can rush the passer, albeit he's a little inconsistent that way, but he's a spark plug of a player and, will instantly come in and kind of be a tone setter for your defense. I think that, obviously this was a need for them and that sort of thing. Edge, being the primary need and the reason I think this defense struggled last year, I'm going to give this pick a minus. Just because I think that Jalen Walker, he's far from the perfect prospect. You were kind of picking him because of his high upside and that sort of thing. But I think he's a very, very, very solid pick at A minus. And then we move on to their other first round pick, James Pierce. I am taking into consideration the trade, that went down, trades that went down in these. If it was something, that's worth noting, obviously, to get James Pierce Jr., we obviously have, the trade. They traded they got the first round pick from the Rams, obviously, but a third round pick. But then, the Rams, they got, the first round pick for next year, and that sort of thing. And then a second and a second round pick. Now, you only lose technically, one, and then a late rounder and whatever else, for the Falcons, but it's kind of steep. It's one of those that you'll look back and, a couple of years from now, and if James Pierce hasn't lived up to expectation, this is overall you're getting swindled, by the Rams, a team that, they really pulled the trigger on this because they haven't had a crazy amount of first round picks, in recent years. They had one this year, obviously, but it was kind of one of those things that it's like, what? They gave up this much? I think that James Pierce, and I guess the other thing that I want to, the other thing that I want to look at, oh goodness, where is it? So the other thing that I want to look at is we didn't have any other edges in the first round, after their edge pick, but you look at who was taken in the second round. You have Ezeraku, Tuimolau, sorry if I mispronounced that, Nick Scordon, Aladeo, even Mike Green, fell this far when people were saying that he was going in the first round and that sort of thing. So it's like you look at, where the Rams, were. Let me see. Right here, I mean, you would have still been on Nick Scorn, Aladeo, Mike Green, who was linked to the Falcons quite a bit. It just seems to me. And then it's like, even in round 3, even if you really didn't want, the picks, I think that Ashton Jalot could be likely a steal in this draft. Landon Jackson, pretty good. Princely to me has crazy upside. I don't know much about Jordan Birch, to be honest with you. Hosea Stewart, no. Savion Jones out of LSU. I mean, there was a good amount of pass rushers that's like, well, not bona fide greats like Abdul Carter, but overall, it just kind of one of those where it's like, what in the world? I'm giving them a C plus for this pick based off of that they gave up too much capital. And I think that I wouldn't say they reached for Pierce. I think he could be a first round talent, but it's one of those things that in looking at this was a guy with off the field issues. What if that comes back to bite him in the ass? And then they're thinking like, we gave up how much for this guy type of thing. So it's like, I'm giving this a C plus, with the plus being that like, yeah, they needed to revamp the edge room. And it's like, they got 2 guys in the first round that hopefully pan out for them, type of thing. Now, their 3rd round pick, and many have said this, makes, could undeniably be the best pick for them. Xavier Watts, who's, a ball hawker, type of thing. And they obviously still have Jesse Bates on them. And I'm sure you guys have maybe heard this if you've watched any other videos. They grab a guy who's similar to a guy already on their team. And, a lot of teams are playing the 2 high safety. So who's going to throw deep really on, Atlanta, with these 2 guys? Xavier Watts, a ball hawker, paired with, paired with Bates. This is going to be an opportunistic secondary room with obviously AJ Terrell at corner as well, and that sort of thing. I am giving this an A+. It was the perfect pick, especially for them getting him at the end of the third round. I mean, this is, very, very good. This was very, very good, for Atlanta, who definitely, I feel like, needed primarily defensive help, and obviously went primarily defense. Now, grabbing Billy Bowman, I'm not so sure about grabbing this guy, to be honest with you, and that sort of thing. So he has kick return promise. I don't know why they would have drafted him for that in the 4th round. This seems like kind of a weird pick by Atlanta, but Atlanta's been doing weird things in the draft for years where they have apparent needs and, usually edge that they don't address. But then this year they're finally like, no, we need to double down on edge while trading a bunch of picks away. But this one doesn't make much sense to me. This is going to be my really low, grade for them. I'm going to give it a D+. It just doesn't make sense to me. They needed safety, I guess, but it's like you already got, one of the best in Watts, just around, 16 picks earlier. Or that sort of thing, unless there was compensatory, I guess. But then looking at their final pick, they get Jack Nelson. I always agree with solidifying the offensive line. I think that, Jack Nelson has good size and that sort of thing. Got a huge standing ovation with the draft being in Green Bay and that sort of thing. So it's like this kid can learn if he pans out, this could be a really good steal. I know that is it Jake Matthews is getting up there in age, so maybe they're looking at, a possible successor there, which I think is, very, very smart. And this kid has, good size, just probably needs a little bit more polish, being a 7th round pick. I am going to give this a B because, there is other positions they still could have addressed. But overall, I think the Falcons were smart with this, and overall, the grade that I'm going to give, this team with obviously, Watts being their, highest graded pick, Walker, and then, James Pierce, or I guess, Jack Nelson, and then James Pierce and Billy Bowman. Overall, I'm going to give this I'm going to give it a B grade, where it's like, oh, you addressed some needs, but you still had some other glaring holes on your team. And especially since you got rid of like Grady Jarrett, and that sort of thing. But overall, a B grade for Atlanta. Let's move on to the next team on here. We are going to go to Carolina. So Carolina, obviously, as we know, got T-Mac with the 8th overall. News of him sliding down, was kind of interesting. A tall guy like that, height just allures. I mean, if a guy has height, that's just kind of icing on the cake of like their potential and that sort of thing. And it's hard for these taller guys unless they go to like a smaller school, they have some glaring issue like drops or something like that. They're going to get grabbed, pretty high. But T-Mac, the grade I'm going to give for him, being that it's Carolina and you're getting a lot of like big, tall guys, contested catch guys for Bryce Young, I'm going to say A minus, only because I think that they could have possibly traded down, maybe a little bit, maybe not. I also think of like some of the players available, you could have, grabbed some better talent. We look at, we obviously look at like who was still available here, after their pick. I think of honestly, like, I think Michael Williams would have been someone, maybe that could have been a huge help on this team. Obviously, not your typical edge and that sort of thing. I also think that, Kenneth Grant paired with Brown would have been kind of monster and that sort of thing they could have traded down for. I also think that like Walter Nolan could have potentially been that kind of spicy inside guy for them, and that sort of thing. Shamar Stewart possibly, and then it's like you look at some of these other guys. I think maybe Emeka Egbuka could have been that workhorse guy for them, where it's like, I mean, maybe you make T-Mac your workhorse type of thing, but you also have Xavier Legette, who's a similar style. And it's like, even if you wanted to trade down and go corner, which I think they needed, you could have went Jahdae Barron. But obviously, a lot of these teams don't know how it's going to fall and that sort of thing. But it's interesting. So it's like those were kind of some of the picks that I was like, maybe these guys would have been like better for them, because there was a lot of good wide receivers in this draft. Not that T-Mac was necessarily a reach, but that's why I'm not giving it as high. I'm giving it a B plus. Now, Nick Scorn out of Texas A&M, I think, very, very solid pick, very solid size. He obviously, this guy kind of fell, because of the way he was used, I guess. But I think that he could be a sneaky good pick, and they really addressed it here. I am going to give this an A, actually. Thinking it was pretty smart. And then I think, Princely, someone who, looks like he has crazy kind of upside, little inconsistent, obviously. But, you got a guy that you can instantly put on the other side from Scorn. And, I love it. And then the third round, I think that's very, very good. I'm going to give this a grade. Because I think that Princely crazy upside, and then the third round could end up being a steal. Trevor Etienne, obviously he's going to be the second guy behind Chuba Hubbard and that sort of thing. I know that Chuba's had some injury concern and that sort of thing. And then it's like you look at Trevor Etienne, he's obviously kind of a smaller guy, not quite like his brother, where it's like he's as speedy or going to be able to be that workhorse sort of dude. But I think that Trevor is, going to be a smart player, and he's going to be able to catch it out of the backfield and give him a dynamic that they probably miss to keep Bryce Young safe as a good safety outlet. I'm giving this a B just because it's not as much of a need, to be honest with you. And I think I think he'll be good, but I don't think you're going to get crazy production. And now Lathan Ransom, who, I love the name, I'm not going to lie. Good side, played for Ohio, obviously, and that sort of thing. So, and fast enough and that sort of thing. So it's like 9 tackles for loss from a safety. That just screams to me very aggressive. I'm assuming they're going to pair this guy with Trayvon Merrick and that sort of thing. So it's kind of cliche in the sense that Merrick is kind of a run stopper, tougher guy as well, is, one thing that I've heard as a comparison and that sort of thing. But never a bad idea to kind of solidify when it's like, who knows if Merrick's gonna pan out, which they paid him a good amount of money, so you really hope that he does. Obviously, I'm giving this a B minus just because I think that he's a player that could be good, but he's just similar skill set to someone they grabbed earlier in the offseason. Cam Jackson, D-tackle, this is the guy, that they'll pair next to Derek Brown. More of your nose tackle size and that sort of thing. So, obviously, long arms and that sort of thing. This is really going to help, that run defense be very, very stout on the Panthers with their front four. Now, obviously, very quick and that sort of thing, but, also powerful, and that sort of thing, being taller and being able to hopefully shift his leverage with those long arms. I can definitely see this being a guy that, maybe could be a potential steal. And what we knew was interior D lineman was the deepest, it's been in a while. It was the deepest position in this class, nearly consensus through just about anybody that paid attention to this draft class. Mitchell Evans, a tight end. They did need a tight end. They did bring back Tommy Tremble, whom I like. I think it is, important to add competition, though, because Tremble has, been good, and I think that he could obviously be better, but he's been in the league for a little bit now. And it's like, maybe it has to do with quarterback play, O-line play, just, an underwhelming offense for years and years. But obviously this is a guy that's he's a big dude, went to Notre Dame, and, quickest 10-yard split amongst tight ends. That's pretty nuts for a big guy like this. I think this could be overall end up being a steal. And it's like, we've seen these 5th round tight ends, end up being crazy. Kittle, you guys, the only name that I really need to say, but obviously, can do it all, eventually be able to do it all. And maybe they make him, maybe he's the number 1 tight end going into week 1. Now, Jimmy Horn Jr., a Colorado wide receiver taken in the 6th, obviously a lighter, speedier guy. But it seemed like that was mostly what they ran with in, Colorado on the Buffs. But I think this is a good pick. I think they kind of needed a guy who's a little bit more of a flashier underneath slot type and that sort of thing. Oh, and I guess I didn't give Mitchell Evans a grade. I'm going to give this an A. I think it's a good pick and a potential steal. And then we move on to Jimmy Horn, slot. The grade I have for him is I am also going to give him an A. I think he could have incredible value and potentially be a starter for them. Maybe not right away just because you're competing with Thielen. And Thielen's the one that kind of works the slot on this team right now, but he's obviously older, and they were thinking like, hey, let's get a guy, to, replace Thielen, whether or not he plays past this year. So overall, I think that that Carolina had a pretty solid draft, to be honest with you. There's obviously, a couple of question marks, in a sense. I think that they could have went CB, instead of Lathan, even Etienne wasn't necessarily like a must-have pick, even though they only really have Chuba. I'm gonna give the Panthers an A- on this draft class because I think they hit with a lot of picks that could give them, potential to start right away and improve this team, and obviously outside of like these first three, to be honest with you, because obviously you look at these three guys, I honestly think that they all obviously, McMillan starting, Scorden obviously, yes. Princely, I wouldn't be surprised if he started right away either. But yeah, an A minus for Carolina, just because they didn't, a couple of picks, like I said. Now moving on, I'm going to, oh no, I'm going on to New Orleans. I guess I am kind of going in order. New Orleans was interesting. I don't agree completely with where they drafted some guys. Kelvin Banks, they were clearly high on. And it was one of those things that it's like you look at, the linemen that were drafted before him. You have Membu and Campbell, obviously, who were the consensus top two, with some people saying Membu would get drafted first. And then it's like Kelvin Banks. And then you kind of look and it's like, you have Gray Zabel, they list as a guard, but, can play tackle, that sort of thing. Tyler Booker, obviously a guard, type of thing. But then it's like Donovan Jackson, but it's like he didn't get an offensive tackle later in the round until Connerly and then Josh Simmons. So it's kind of interesting to me that, the Saints did this with, Kelvin Banks. He's not that he's a bad talent, but a top 10 pick talent. And it's like, obviously pro comp Rashawn Slater, kudos to Rashawn Slater for obviously, having people compare to him already. But it's like, and then obviously he's been, very good for the Chargers. But Kelvin Banks, I guess he fits that kind of mauler that the, and bigger guy that the I guess he's not quite a mauler, but that bigger guy that the Saints seem to draft, to be honest, for their O-line. And it's like whoever the quarterback is, whether that's Derek Carr, I wouldn't even start Carr if I were them. It seems, the jury's been out on Carr for years. It's like I would, if it was me, I would start Spencer Rattler and have him in a QB competition with the guy you drafted in the second round. Now, Kelvin Banks, just because of the reach, I'm going to get, even though it's like, I think that, even though it doesn't say it's a need, I think it is somewhat of a need for this team. I'm going to give it a B+. And then you look at Tyler Shoe. I'm not going to lie. Shoe, I feel like, he's got, good size, 6'5", 219 out of Louisville. But then you look at, the pro comp, Joe Flacco, not bad. That type of thing, big arm and that sort of thing. But it's like, who do the Saints have that you're bombing it to deep that much? Perhaps they just really, really like the kid. But it's like this pick to me just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. They do say QB as a need, but it's like, give Spencer Rattler a shot. He played with some flair when Carr was out last year. It wasn't pretty, obviously, but he was on a very, injury-riddled offense where it's like, who the heck did they have starting? Type of thing. But, looking at Tyler Shoe, I'm gonna say this is a D+ pick, and that sort of thing. And it's like, the other reason I would say give Rattler a shot is you didn't invest a lot into him. You still have him for, 3 more years, and it's like, if you really didn't pan out this year, then next year, you can draft Archie Manning or something. But, I'm going to give this a D+. I just don't get it. There's other positions you could have taken. Vernon Broughton, D tackle, I fully agree with grabbing, the most stacked, position type of thing out of Texas here, and that sort of thing. What is I guess there's not even a comp here, but, he can even play defensive end, type of thing, a versatile guy, and that sort of thing. So, you look at this kind of you you look at this, obviously this is a guy that they want to bring in and wants to start, on a D line that is aging, and, you need to get some new young blood in there. Even though it wasn't that, I mean, they said it wasn't a need, but you have so many needs on the Saints. They're such a bad team, in all honesty. They got a few studs, around, but it's like they're such a bad team. It's kind of hard to grade these because it's like I don't think that there's a crazy bad pick for any position for this team, except for Tyler Shue, which was just an early reach. Vernon Browden in the 3rd round. I'm gonna say it's a C plus because I think that at this point you still had a good number of like wide receivers too, and I feel like you do need wide receivers, to which they didn't draft any, in when a lot of them were injured last year. Jonas Sanker, they didn't need a safety, but apparently they wanted Sanker. They bring in Reed, who left the Chiefs. And then they're like, no, let's, it's just bizarre because it's like, even looking at this aggressive notion right here, it's like you're telling me that Reed isn't aggressive. That guy, he's been a physical safety for years, willing to go up and make any tackle the team needs, and make a play. And it's like this guy had a really quick, maybe they saw something, and it's like they were like, this guy is kind of a steal at this spot, which is the only thing that I can see. And I know that they have Tyrann Mathieu still, but he's getting up there in age. So this guy looks like he could maybe replace that honey badger mentality with actual good size, so I don't want to rate this one like too low because it looks like a guy that could be very good, even though it was in the 3rd round. I'm going to say a B minus, just because it wasn't a position need. I think there's plenty of other guys they had. Now, Danny Stutzman, like the name, linebacker wasn't a need again. This guy more of a cover dude. Obviously, you have Demario Davis on this team, was a very, very good linebacker, and it's like 3-year starter, 348 tackles, and then 34.5 tackles for loss. That's very good, to be honest with you. On an Oklahoma team that I know just through living in Colorado hasn't been very good, sort of thing. So he's quick, he can shoot gaps, and do a number of things. I kind of like this pick, in the 4th round. It seems like they got a guy who could, potentially learn and potentially be like a difference maker for years. I'm going to give this one a B, though, because it's not a crazy position of need, And then moving on, we have Quincy Riley, a cornerback, their 2nd highest need, obviously trading Marshawn Lattimore, a guy out of Louisville. So Quincy Riley, obviously kind of a dude who's, not undersized. He's close to 200. He's a bit, stronger than some of the other taller guys that are around this range in this draft and that sort of thing. But you look at, he lined up outside and that sort of thing. But, you look at the size, you think of this guy as more of a slot guy, smaller hands. But it looks like this guy has good ball skills, which I think is something that the Saints really do like, and I think that this kind of goes to show that, like, their new head coach, obviously coming from the Eagles, obviously with them playing a ton of man last year, maybe this guy looks like he has good hand skills and, perhaps he overperforms and that sort of thing. So I am going to give this a minus because it seems like they got a feisty guy, which is what I think about when I think of the Saints DBs. Marshawn Lattimore obviously embodied that, but they were like, we can get rid of this guy, save some money, and he is getting, and obviously Lattimore was getting a little bit injury. And then Devin Neal in the 6th round. This is my favorite pick for this team. And it might sound crazy because, hey, it doesn't say halfbacks in need. We have Alvin Kamara. We all know Alvin Kamara, as juiced legs, can do a lot of things, but he gets injured because, he can't be the workhorse guy. It's just been proven year after year that he's going to miss some time. Devin Neal, to me, looked like he could have been, a third or a fourth round talent. And I mean, obviously, a lot of the running backs in this class were very, very good, at their own things, and on a lot of them, great uses and that sort of thing. But like Devin Neal looks like he could be a workhorse back with 5'11", 213. He obviously is the first to, do this in 3 straight seasons at 1K yards and that sort of thing. And it looks like he's an intelligent runner. So it's like, I really, really like this pick for them. I think it was, kind of an under the radar pick. Maybe he doesn't see as crazy a playing time as we envision, just because Kamara obviously is really good. But if Kamara gets hurt, there is no doubt in my mind that Devin Neal could, do very, very well. So I'm going to say for this pick, I'm going to give it an A. And I think that's very solid despite them saying that it's not a position of need, So then we move on and we have a tight end, Mataveo, a 6'6", 260 out of UCLA, a big guy, which I feel like, is pretty typical for UCLA, going after these bigger, physically dominant guys, and that sort of thing. Obviously, the Bruins didn't do anything crazy receiving-wise because this guy led the team with 506 receiving yards. He's obviously a quick dude, very tall. And it's like what I said about, these... it's like what I said about, these guys, that it's like these later round tight ends. There's just something about, but it's like this guy has, the size you want, the height you want, the speed you want. Just mold him into something great. And maybe this guy's your next, Jimmy Graham, even though Jimmy Graham was like 6'7", But this one I'm going to give even though they didn't say it was a need, you get a guy like this and he fills somewhat of a wide receiver role of a big wide receiver, in a sense. And I'm going to give this an A-. Now, moving on to the final pick, Fadil Diggs out of Syracuse. Don't know much about this guy, to be honest with you. So he did play for Texas A&M, transferred, and he led Syracuse in TFL and sacks. His tape, not as good as the production and that sort of thing. He ran the 3rd fastest 40. I mean, with this size, that is scary. A 6'4", nearly 260-pound guy. So obviously, this is very good that they took him very, very late because it's, it's as it says here. This guy has good intangibles, and that sort of thing. And, overall, I do think that their edge room needs to get a little bit younger. But you have this guy under, tutelage from Cameron Jordan, and that sort of thing. And maybe he can turn into something special. It seems like a very good flyer pick for, crazy late in the draft from a guy, that, hey, maybe this guy fits like, a size and speed and physical threshold. I'm going to give this Fadil Diggs one an A. And overall for the Saints, I think that, some of the picks, I'm like, what? But some of the picks, I'm like, hey, yes. And that sort of thing. I am going to give them a B+ for their draft. And then we move on to the final team, the Buccaneers. So the Buccaneers had an interesting draft. I thought it was very odd that they grabbed Igbuka in the 1st round. Now, thinking about it post, I do think that the Buccaneers are they're not gandering this pick away and they're just grabbing, the best player available. Chris Godwin is coming off an ACL and, he's come off of serious injury before, but you never know when it's really going to catch up to you. And it's not like Godwin is crazy old or anything, he's, technically would be in his prime right now, as a wide receiver. But then you think about Mike Evans, and it's like, Mike Evans can be that clutch player that you need. Did miss sometime last year. And then you look at, their third wide receiver. Goodness, I'm not going to lie. I forget his name, the rookie that they drafted last year, and he was very good. But it's one of those things that it's like, imagine if you're missing Godwin and Evans, and, Baker did well with, whatever he had. He did very, very well. This wasn't like some, fluke of Baker, doing well and that sort of thing, and, essentially kind of carrying this team, sometimes willing them to victory and that sort of thing. But it's like they wanted to get him someone that it's like can definitely come in and, have that instant pro impact, and they grabbed Ibuka. I think it was a good pick. This was his range. I think that with, who was available, after this pick, you kind of think, it's like they could have gotten Jahdae Barron, wouldn't have complained with that pick either because it's a team that needs corner, but they did address it. And then you look at some of these other, players. Obviously, Golden would have been another wide receiver, that they could have went, type of thing. But then it's like, the guy is lower than this. You're not really trading down for, any of these guys, type of thing. Perhaps you could have grabbed Jahad Campbell. I think I theorized that, hey, they have Levante David, but, if they added Jahad Campbell, he could be Levante David's successor, even though Levante David's aged like fine wine type of thing. So it's like, and it's like, I like that Tampa Bay didn't trade any of their picks. I think that they were like, we're going to stick to our board. We're going to stick to our wits here and draft intelligently, which I think, some teams could learn from, to be honest with you. So Ibuka, just because it wasn't the craziest position of need, even though it is, I guess, fourth highest here. And it's like you didn't really, and like I said, you could have went Jahad Campbell here. Obviously, CB, Barron, maybe, edge. It kind of proved that you didn't need to go edge right away with the later of your draft, knowing what they drafted. So Ibuka's grade, I'm going to give a B+, only because he may not get substantial playing time right away. Just because, they know that their top three guys from last year, it's like maybe, and I guess I don't know what the scenario is on Godwin and if he'll be ready for the start of the season, but if he's not, Ibuka will, of course, get playing time and produce. Number 2, Benjamin Morrison. I like this pick. This was a guy that, there was a good amount of DBs that had very high upside, and it's like, oh, these guys can ball, but they went late. Like even Will Johnson, went later than many imagined, so it's like, and then Benjamin Morrison, I think, was a little bit behind him. Siobhan Revel, type of thing went, a little bit lower than, what his talent could be. The Cowboys, there was a few of those guys, and Benjamin Morrison, I think, is a good, sleeper pick, and I don't think it's that much of a reach with the injury concern being a later second-round guy. I'm going to give this an A. And then you go and you grab Jacob Parrish as well. Jacob Parrish, kind of your prototypical slot guy. Benjamin Morrison obviously can play outside. He's, a lot of these, corners were on the lighter side. Maybe that's why, you have the injury concern with them being a little bit less durable and that sort of thing. But it's like, you look at Parrish, he fits kind of the slot mentality and that sort of thing, and obviously, crazy good speed and that sort of thing. So, he played outside, but then they're like, oh, he also played over the slot. So it's like a guy who can, play wherever, depending on camp and how they want to use this gentleman. But it's like, he looks like he could be a very suitable thing. I'm also giving this an A because, the one thing that I would say about the Buccaneers is that they desperate for good corner play. And then you move on to the two straight edge picks, and David Walker. So David Walker had good production, is stockier in size, but it's like this production to me, it just tells me that, hey, this guy can do, good things. And he looks like he fits the mold of Buccaneers because they require that their guys are able to stop the run, for, just about every pick. It's not enough to be a good pass rusher, but it's like they had this guy, fall into their lap. And I think it was a very solid pick in the 4th round, right? Where David Walker, round 4, maybe 5 would have went. Type of thing. I'm going to give this an A-. Now, Elijah Roberts, a guy who's a bit bigger, obviously very good, very good dynamic player, 4 forced fumbles in 2 seasons, very, very good. A guy that can do a little bit of everything, but it's like, and also has good size, that could see playing time type of thing. Elijah Roberts, I'm giving an A to as well, because I think that they have a very well-rounded, rush room now with the addition of, I forget, the former Eagle, Jet. Why can't I remember his name? I think that they have a very well-rounded edge room now where they're potentially not going to have to worry too much about it, hopefully. Tez Johnson, the lightest guy in the draft. So Tez Johnson, 154 pounds, crazy light, type of thing. And he didn't have a crazy 40 at, 4.5. But it's like a dude like this that's smaller, is shifty and that sort of thing. I'm going to say, because they needed wide receiver, that this is a guy that, maybe they're not even using this guy. I saw kind of a highlight reel of him kick returning. I think that could be the use for him. I'm not sure that the Buccaneers really have a kick returner. Me thinking about their roster and that sort of thing, that's kind of designated to that. But Tez Johnson, very shifty, very left-right lateral type of thing. So, obviously, it looks like an intelligent player. I kind of like it, root for the little guy, quite literally here. I'm going to give this one a B just because, I feel like there was some good late round linebackers that you could have went, I guess. Let me even see, who would have went after this pick. Where is maybe not. Where is the Buccaneers pick? Oh, it's right here. So, maybe I was wrong. Maybe there wasn't any linebackers. Yeah, there wasn't any linebackers taken, then, but it's kind of one of those things that it's like, was there any linebackers taken earlier? Bruner, don't know much about him. Lindenberg out of Minnesota. Some of the guys that I was high on, that I was like, these guys could be they could be a late, round difference maker at linebacker. McLeod, type of thing. Kobe Kane, I definitely, was kind of high on. Don't know much on Medrano, to be honest with you, but it's like, you could have maybe traded up. Obviously, I commended this team on, not surrendering picks needlessly. Now, obviously, it is a late round pick, but, overall, I think, this team would have benefited from having like a 6th rounder, I guess. But overall, Tez Johnson, I'm going to give a B just because, if you have a good returnman, it's great. And a guy who's seasoned at it, which is what I think that they'll use him for. And I guess with the bolster to your defense, you need a return man. Obviously, I think that the Buccaneers followed through on their strategy, and for that, I'm giving this draft grade an A. So, with that being said, I'm, that's going to be the end of this video, but I think that overall, this division kind of had an interesting draft. I did say that last, this division has been my reigning dumpster fire division, being the worst division in the league, type of thing. I think it's hard to argue that there's any other division that have been weaker than this division, but I think that overall they added pieces they needed to, and it could be very interesting in the NFC South. But if you made it this far to the video and you want to leave a comment, on what you thought about these draft picks and the trades. I know we only really talked about the James Pierce Jr. one because that's obviously kind of a one that's like, hey, only time will tell, if he's a bust. But leave a like, comment, and even subscribe for videos twice a week at minimum. I know last week that I missed Tuesday, but, here's to uploading our regular Tuesday videos and, to continue on. Obviously, this series will continue on with, the next division that I cover, on Friday. And I want to thank you all for watching. And as always, go Pack, go.